Hey everyone, it's the All Good Things Star Trek podcast, Star Trek Discovery Canon Eggs video for episode 6 of Star Trek Discovery, Lethe. I'm Barry Wallace, I'm one of the co-hosts. Thank you for joining me this afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Let's talk about the episode that has just aired, episode 6 of Star Trek Discovery, Lethe. And I'm sorry, I should have really researched the pronunciation. Excuse me, I believe it is Lethe. We'll talk about that really quick before we start. It's not really a canon egg, but just in case you were wondering, Lethe was one of the 5 rivers of Hades, and it was the river of forgetfulness. There's Styx. I used to know them, but anyway, there are 3 or 4 other rivers that flow through the mythological underworld of Hades. And Lethe is the river of forgetfulness or of oblivion, which is an interesting sort of take on the definition for this episode. All right, we're going to jump right into it. The big one right off the top of the show was a name drop of the Enterprise. We finally got the name drop of the Enterprise Constitution class, the old NCC 1701. It's there. It's being captained by Captain Pike, Commander Spock. I believe in this time period, I think they're right around the time when they actually run into the world where the Keepers are, which name escapes me in a moment. Anyway, we have a name drop of the Enterprise. We also see what looks to be a holodeck. A holodeck in TOS era? What's that about? There's an animated series episode called Practical Joker, where there is an actual holodeck. They call it a recreation room, but it is a holodeck, and I believe it is built on the technology from the Shore Leave planet. Not sure if that's for sure the case, but we've seen it barely in canon in TAS. So yes, if you're wondering why in the world there's a holodeck on a TOS ship, there you go. It was established in the animated series. They mentioned Ash Tyler's mother was on her way to the moons of Grazer when her shuttle was destroyed. Grazer, the planet Grazer, or the system of Grazer, the Grazerites were the people that lived there. And if you remember from Deep Space Nine episodes of Homefront and Paradise Lost, the two-parter where the changelings were supposedly taking over Starfleet Command, the president of the Federation, Jarish Inyo, was a Grazerite. So there we have an established alien from that culture in Deep Space Nine. Let's see. I'm gonna skip over Sarek and a lot of his backstory for the moment because there's really not a whole lot else. We mentioned we saw the Iridian Nebula, where a nebula near Iridia is where Sarek's shuttle was lost. The Iridians were seen throughout Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. They were an alien race. They had very wrinkled features, face. A domed head, bald head. We saw them. One of them was leading Worf to the planet in Birthright, Part 1, where supposedly the survivors of the Kittimer massacre were located. That was a Iridian that was leading him there. We also saw one. There was a mention in the episode of Voyager Equinox that it was believed that the race was almost extinct, and the captain of the Equinox was able to find some of them and bring them back into the Federation. So we've seen Iridians throughout Star Trek, and a nebula near Iridia is where Sarek's shuttle was found. We saw a Vulcan lyre, Lyre, the plucky guitar-looking thing that Spock plays all the time in Sarek's. In his mind, his remembrance of that graduation ceremony that Michael Burnham was entering into Sarek's mind through his Contra, we saw a woman playing a Vulcan lyre, so that was nice to have that callback to it. There was a mention that Amanda Grayson, Michael Burnham's foster mother, took her at one time on her 10th birthday to a planet called or at least a star somewhere called Eridani D, the 7th moon of this location. Well, it's been established in canon. It's never really been specified on screen by dialogue, but it's been in some background notation, star charts, displays here and there, and then actually Gene Roddenberry verified it at one point. The real-life star that Vulcan supposedly orbits in fiction in Star Trek is 40 Eridani A. That is the main star of a triple star system. in the constellation Eridanus. 40 Eridani A is the Vulcan sun. It is a red dwarf star. B and C, Eridani B and C, are companion stars that are very close by to this system. The Vulcan system has an inner planet. It has Vulcan, the planet itself, which is in a complementary orbit with another planet called Takut, which is mentioned in a couple of different places. And then it has an asteroid belt, excuse me. And then beyond the asteroid belt is one more icy planetoid called Delta Vega, which we saw in the 2009 Star Trek movie from J.J. Abrams. That is the compilation of the Vulcan system around the star 40 Eridani A, with, of course, B and C together. Now, Eridani D, is it a star? Is it a planet? Is it in that system? Is it in another star system in the constellation Eridanus, of which there are about 1 million? And believe me, I looked it up. There's a bunch. We don't know. Anyway, it's someplace that has at least 7 moons. It could be a planet. It's most likely a planet, and I am guessing it is probably a planet somewhere else in the system that is not generally known about, or is perhaps an artificial satellite, an artificial planet. Who knows? Anyway, that's what that is all about. And I just thought it was really interesting to bring up the Eridani A system as the official quasi-canon star of Vulcan. All right, let's talk Sarek and the Vulcan people. First of all, the logical extremists. This is the group. The person blew himself up, injected himself with a substance that blew him up on Sarek's shuttle. These people are isolationists of Vulcan. They do not believe that the Vulcans should be mixing with humans. They should not be part of the failed experiment of the United Federation of Planets. We see a version of that philosophy many years later in the Next Generation episode of Gambit. If you remember, that was when Picard was supposedly killed, and he went undercover with a pirate group trying to recover some Vulcan artifacts that were used in a long ago war to amplify their mental powers. The character on that episode that was played by Robin Curtis, she was supposedly a Vulcan, but she's actually a Romulan. I believe that's right, or it's reversed. She was thought to be a Romulan, but she was actually a Vulcan. Anyway, she was a member of an isolationist group that was active in the Vulcan culture in the 24th century. So here we are in the 23rd. There is another similar type of movement to keep logic pure among the Vulcans and to rid it of human influences. I can only assume Andorian, Tellarite, anybody else from the Federation. And we've seen that. Now we're looking at 3 different centuries of Vulcan culture. From the series Enterprise in the 22nd century with Jonathan Archer and T'Pol and all of them, there was a feeling from the Vulcans of that era that, yes, we found Earth. We are going to help you as if we were a mentor, an older brother, bringing them on as if the humans were a child. But not a lot of love lost between the Vulcans of that era. And it was reflected in the Terra Prime movement from Earth in the Enterprise, which was a similar movement to keep Earth clear of non-human influences like the Vulcans. So it's very sad, I guess my commentary would be, that in the 22nd, the 23rd, the 24th centuries, there are still movements out there that are dedicated to keeping their own group of people pure and free of outside influences. And unfortunately, in our fictional worlds, those still go beyond present day. But I guess all I can say is I hope that we can try to eradicate that in our own 21st century. Moving on. They mentioned the UFP is a failed experiment. They talk about the Contra again. I didn't mention this before, and I should have in the very first couple of episodes. If you're wondering where the word Contra came from, Star Trek 3 and Star Trek 4, the movies, actually the end of Star Trek 2 as well. You remember Spock transferred his Contra, his soul, his essence, from his own self into Leonard McCoy. McCoy carried it throughout Star Trek III Search for Spock. There was a, a ceremony on Vulcan at the end of the movie that removed the Contra from McCoy, put it back into Spock, and Spock was his own happy, merry self for the rest of the series. But that is the Vulcan soul, and there's some stories, and in fact, the novelization of Star Trek III is fascinating. If you have a chance to read it, it talks about where they stored souls of the ancient Vulcans, and that Vulcans never actually died. They transferred their Katra to receptacles similar to the ones from Sargon and Talesa in Return of Tomorrow on TOS, those round vessels that held their essences. There's stories about that throughout the novelizations of TOS. Anyway, that Katra is what Sarek used to heal Michael Burnham when the Vulcan Learning Center was bombed early in her life. So that's what that's all about. It's the Vulcan soul with their psychic powers, their techniques, their abilities. They are able to name and quantify their own essence and transfer it, use it to heal, store it, play tennis with it. I don't know. I mean, anyway, that's what that is. Oh yeah, there's a great mention of something that Sarek does, and we see it reflected throughout all his appearances on television Trek. Is that there's the quote is that he has a unique ability to forge relationships between races that do not follow logic-based ideology. We saw him in the in Journey to Babel, which is the first TOS episode that we saw Sarek. Excuse me. He was on a mission to negotiate the admission of the planet Corridon into the Federation. He was also in Next Generation, the episode called Sarek. He was moving to negotiate a race called the Ligarans, some sort of treaty with them. And that's been the kind of Sarek's hallmark throughout his whole existence, is the fact that he married a human woman. He had a Vulcan, half human, half Vulcan child that he raised with his human wife. Later on in life, he marries another human woman, Perrin, in Next Generation era. He is a champion of bringing Vulcans and humans together, and as such, as we see in the very beginning of the episode, the Vulcan isolationists, the logic extremists, were intent on blowing him up and destroying him because they did not want that mindset to continue and to sully, to contaminate the pure logic of the Vulcan race. So that's what Sarek is all about, and we've seen it in his character all throughout Trek. And then finally, there's a bit of a continuity glitch. Now, bear with me; this is a little complicated. We know that when in Spock and Sarek's relationship, from the very beginning, from Journey to Babel all the way through Star Trek 3 and 4, that there was a rift between Spock and Sarek at some point during Spock's young life. The story is that Sarek was grooming Spock once he was able to be of age to join the Vulcan Science Academy, as apparently he had, joined the diplomatic corps, be a scientist, all those kind of things that are so very, very Vulcan. Spock, feeling the call of his human half, decided to buck his father's wishes and join Starfleet, which he did. And they did not make up about that or come to terms about that until much later in life, at the end of Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. We see in this episode there are a couple of different Vulcan institutions that are named. They've been mentioned a little bit before, but they're really more well defined here. The first one is the Vulcan Learning Center. Now, you remember in the 2009 Star Trek movie when we saw sort of the origin of young Spock, he was in these learning pits where he was a child and he was learning about, basically he was going to elementary school is what it amounted to. And we saw a little bit of that actually in a similar kind of thing to that in his re-education in Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. All the questions that he was being bombarded with. was very similar to the Vulcan Learning Center. Now, Michael Burnham from Discovery is the first human to be educated in the Vulcan Learning Center as well. And we saw a little bit of her. And that learning center was bombed by these logic extremists, which is how the Contra save meld first happened with Sarek. Anyway, her graduation from the learning center, which I would assume to be somewhat of a high school graduation, equivalent of high school graduation, is where we see this episode take place in Sarek's mind. Well, at the conclusion of her, I'm sorry, let me back up. That's not where we are. The Learning Center, she went through that as a child. Then she entered the Vulcan Science Academy. That's the second of the two institutions that I want to talk about. The Vulcan Science Academy is what Michael Burnham went through and was the first human to graduate from there, and she graduated with honors and was a shoo-in to be chosen to join the Vulcan Science Expedition. But they did not want her because they gave Sarek the ultimatum, either her or Spock. Now, here's the glitch. Sarek and Spock were at odds because Spock decided not to join the Vulcan Science Academy, which is the equivalent of college on Vulcan, I guess is the best equivalent. Instead, he went on to Starfleet Academy. Well, it says in this episode of Discovery, that they gave Sarek the choice for Spock to join the Learning Academy or Michael Burnham, and Sarek chose Spock. Well, at that time, Spock had not even entered the Science Academy, which was the equivalent of college. The Science Expedition, the expeditionary group, was a postgraduate position that Vulcans tried to get into, to go out into space and do stuff. In fact, the people that landed on Earth back from Zefram Cochrane's day probably were part of the Vulcan expeditionary group. So there's a bit of a dichotomy about the timelines, and they've established it was Spock decided not to go into the Vulcan expeditionary group, not the Science Academy, although it was established it was the Science Academy back in TOS. So there's a little bit of a confusion between what those groups are, what they do. Hopefully it'll be resolved as time goes on. Anyway, that's it for episode 6. I'm sure that was extremely confusing. If you can figure it out better than me, please let me know. All Good Things Star Trek Podcast is at agtpod@gmail.com. Twitter and Facebook is agtpod as well. allgoodthings.podbean.com is the website. We'll be back next week. Thank you for joining us. Live long and prosper.